Great. So thank you for inviting me. I've been a member of UNSW in the Kensington campus for 15 or more years, and I've never set foot on the UNSW Canberra campus, but it feels just like home. I see the letterhead UNSW, the familiar yellow border on the slide template, just like home. So it is a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I saw the theme of the conference around mental models and was naturally drawn to it. I've done most of my research and consulting work on trying to understand mental models, try to intervene and impact and influence mental models to some extent over the last 2 decades. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what I've learned about mental models and what some of the research that others have done that helps shed light on trying to help us understand more about the different components of mental models, and then close with some challenges, I think, for our research programs and our interventions and practice going forward. So what are mental models? Well, we all have talked about mental models, and it's the theme, but do we really understand what we're talking about? Let's just be clear, because there's lots of different definitions in the academic literature as well as the practitioner literature. So here's a definition from Johnson Laird, who's a pretty famous psychologist. The psychological core of understanding anything consists of having a working model of the phenomenon in your mind. If you understand inflation, a mathematical proof, the way a computer or DNA works, you have a mental representation that serves as a model. So I think that gives a pretty good description. You know, it's not as complex as the real system. It's a simplified mental representation that helps us navigate that real world in a way that's meaningful for us, and it helps us take action, make decisions, and so forth. Here's another quote from Jay Forrester, the founder of System Dynamics, actually that predates the Johnson-Laird quote by some years. Each of us uses models constantly. Every person in private life and in business instinctively uses models for decision making. The mental images in one's head about one's surroundings are models. A mental image is a model. All decisions are taken on the basis of models. And I remember interacting with Jay when I was an undergraduate at MIT, working in one of the research projects that he was passionate about. And one of his favorite sayings, or at least one of the favorite interactions he had, was around people doubting whether or not it was useful to build simulation models to try and make decisions in the various complex systems in which we operate, in organizations of all sort, or at society level. And one of his favorite sayings was, look, we're already making all of our decisions and taking all of our actions on a model. It just so happens that model is not explicit. It's not a formal mathematical model. It's the model that's in our minds. It's our mental model. And so I think that the combination of these two quotes sort of helps define what we're talking about in terms of mental models. When you look at everything that's been written or said about mental models, and I've been collecting little snippets of how people talk about mental models for over 2 decades, there are lots of alternative terms. So here you can see a whole handful of terms: cognitive maps, interpretive schemes, industry recipes, implicit theories, screens, routines, and so forth. There's another panel where that came from, and this is just a small sample of all of these terms that I've been collecting over the last 2 decades. It is one of the most, in some ways, it's encouraging, because it means that the sort of thing that I'm looking at in my research and doing in practice is really important, because it keeps coming up in many different ways with different terminology. On the other hand, it's a bit frustrating, because it's hard to get a grapple on exactly what we're talking about, and to advance our understanding in a cumulative way about these about mental models when our language is so disparate. So here's an example. I want to share with you an example of a mental model from a context that I know well, which is corporate strategy. That's where I do most of my work. And this is an image that is in the Disney archives that shows the connections between the different lines of business within Disney. And I don't know how easy it is for those of you to see. It's a rather complicated diagram, which of course is part of the point, right? Reality is complex. The mental models, the shared mental models that we develop of that reality are not typically going to be simple. They're not going to be simple answers. Instead, they are going to be complex. So here's the television business, the creative talent studio, film business, merchandising, licensing, Disneyland, the amusement parks, publications, Walt Disney Magazine, comic strips, and the music business. And you can see all of these interrelationships that the executives at Disney, and this was back in 1957, and this is from the Disney archives, when Walt Disney and a whole series of senior managers in the senior leadership team got together and tried to understand how their business operated. What was the corporate strategy? Were there some mutually reinforcing benefits of being in all of these businesses, or were the trade-offs between them going to be too tough to manage? And so here's what they came up with in terms of their mental model, their shared mental model of how the corporate strategy of Disney fits together. Since I was coming to the Defense Force Academy, I thought it might be useful to show a military mental model of Afghanistan stability as another example here. And many of you may be familiar with this feedback loop diagram. How many people have seen this one? Lots of you, yeah. So again, pretty complex, right? Not a simple answer, but it does capture a shared mental model of a very, very complex situation to try and bring stability to a very tough part of the world. Now, I remember when I first saw this, I have friends in PA Consulting Group who worked on this project. I first saw it, like many of you perhaps, there was an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, but I'm not 100% sure which paper ran the article. And the article really, in some ways, made fun of this diagram by calling it a spaghetti diagram, too complex for comprehension. But in fact, I think they missed the point, that in fact, that is exactly why you want to make such maps, such causal maps explicit, is so that you don't have to operate on an internal mental model of holding all of these factors in your mind and trying to mentally simulate what the consequences of all of those interdependent factors are going to look like. I use this diagram in an executive education course as an example, much like today, a few years ago, and much to my amazement and a little bit of trepidation, someone in the room had actually worked on this project in terms of coming up with it. He was a member of the Australian Defence Forces, and I was worried that he was going to say, "Oh, that project, that ended up providing no value in terms of our actual understanding of the real situation." But on the contrary, thankfully, in front of the exec ed audience, he said, "Look, that was really valuable. The understanding, the level of learning that the folks who worked closely on that project were able to achieve as a part of that process was really phenomenal." So those are a couple of examples of shared mental models in very different organizations. A lot of my research has been focused on trying to understand what we know about mental models, what the components of those mental models are, what sorts of errors we make in developing our mental models, and how those deficiencies in our mental models impair our performance or maybe perhaps not impair our performance in some situations. So here is a diagram that I use to sort of classify the different components of mental models. And I like to start down here at the bottom with perceived causal relationships. That's really where I think mental models begin, and it's what most of us think of when we think of mental models. Are these causal maps, these causal diagrams, much like the previous two examples that I showed, that have a whole series of perceived causal relationships. The perceived causal relationships that are drawn in the box here, E is a causal factor for B, B is a causal factor for A, D is a causal factor for B, C is a causal factor from D, and so on. This is purposeful in the sense that I wanted to illustrate that most of the times our mental models are not composed of really complex, rich information feedback structures like the last two examples I showed. You only get to that point after really thinking carefully, oftentimes with a group or a team that have a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge about the domain that you're trying to understand. More typically, you have a partial understanding as an individual. And until you try and really make those things explicit, that partial understanding persists. And so here what you see is very small chains of cause and effect. So 3 or 4 or 5 causal factors at most linked together, and that those separate chunks, if you will, of causal factors are themselves not linked together. They are separated. So you've got one causal chunk of information here and a separate one here, and there's no connection between them, no interdependency in the mental model between them. So these perceived causal relationships I think of as really the foundation of our mental models. And there's a lot of work that's been done over the last 10 years in psychology and cognitive science, which backs that up. I mean, essentially, the role of causal reasoning in psychology, state-of-the-art psychological research, is really at the forefront of trying to understand how people solve problems, particularly complex problems. From the perceived causal relationships, we develop overarching strategies. These overarching strategies are appropriate for whatever domain we're operating in. So within a commercial organization like Disney, maybe they've got a strategy for how many new films that they're going to launch every year, or are they going to open new amusement parks around the world and try and grow the organization that way. There's an overarching strategy that comes together out of the Gestalt understanding that you have from these perceived causal relationships. Once you have a strategy in mind, an overarching strategy, then the way to implement or execute that strategy is through adopting different decision rules. And decision rules don't spring forth complete initially. You have to learn them. And so oftentimes it's by trial and error. It's by what are the traditions, the history, the momentum in the organization, whatever type of organization it is. And of course, the decision rules can evolve over time if there's appropriate feedback that those decision rules need to change. And so I think of those components, those 3 components from the bottom there, perceived causal relationships, strategies, and decision rules, really as different components of mental models. So when I talk about mental models, it's not just the causal relationships that people believe are operating, it's also the overarching strategies to make use of those causal relationships, and then it's the decision rules that they adopt to implement those strategies. And the combination of those gives rise to the performance outcomes in whatever context you're operating in. So in a corporate strategy context, gives rise to market share or net income or profits. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a system dynamics or a systems thinking conference if we didn't have some feedback drawn between those components, right? So our perceived causal relationships can be updated and evolve over time in response to information feedback from the environment about how well we're operating. Our decision rules, as I said, can change, and so can our strategies. So I really think about mental models in these different components. So they enable us to make sense of our complexity, help us process information quickly, and make decisions under uncertainty, and often provide good enough solutions. But as I said before, they are not accurate representations. They're incomplete and constantly evolving, or more worrisome, not evolving at all, stuck in cognitive inertia. And they typically contain biases, errors, and contradictions. So a lot of my research, as I said before, focuses on understanding those components and understanding the errors and other deficiencies that we have in our mental models. So I'll just talk briefly about two studies that I've done with various co-authors. One study is about the relationship between mental models, decision rules, and performance heterogeneity, and another is around the dynamic decision-making using the balanced scorecard framework. These examples, of course, are from my domain of competitive strategy or corporate strategy, and so you'll have to make the transfer, the analogical transfer to your domain. So study one. In study one, these are two experimental lab studies. I also do a lot of field work with organizations, but I won't talk about that work today. I'll talk about some of the lab studies that I've done. So this study one uses a new product launch simulation that many of you will be very familiar with. How many of you are familiar with the boom and bust enterprises, B&B enterprises? Fewer than I thought. None, maybe. Just a handful. Okay, so B&B Enterprises was developed by John Sterman. It was created, I guess, in the early 90s, maybe late 1980s, and it's been used ever since for executive ed training programs and MBA programs and undergraduate business student programs to help people learn about the challenge of managing the life cycle of a new product, all the way from launching that new product through the entire life cycle. And so in a management school, that's this is a simulation that I use commonly in my classroom and coursework and executive ed work. The study had three phases: a learning phase, where the participants did 3 simulation runs on this microworld simulation, an immediate testing phase with 3 more simulation runs, and then a delayed testing phase 18 weeks later, with 3 more simulation runs. In between the learning phase and the immediate testing phase, we measured their mental models. We wanted to understand what they understood about this competitive context that they were operating in. And then, as I said, we did the delayed testing phase afterwards. Our measures, our performance measure was cumulative net income. We were most worried about maximizing long-term profits. And for mental model accuracy, we measured the perceived causal relationships. We measured participants' ability to mentally simulate very small sections of the feedback structure. And when I say small sections, I mean combining 2 or 3 or at maximum 4 variables at a time. Can they mentally simulate the dynamic consequences of the interactions between that small of a set of variables? And these were all, by the way, these mental model measures were about the microworld. They were about the simulated context in which they were operating. And then finally, we also did a measure of their knowledge of the core feedback structure. So which was just a subset, really, of the first two, the perceived causal relationships and mental simulations of small sets of the structure. The knowledge of the core feedback structure was a set of that, and it was just really isolating the market diffusion process, which was the core feedback structure in the simulation. Did they understand that? And ignoring the other components of the feedback structure. So the performance that we got over the 9 complete simulation runs, you can see here, we randomized the participants across a low complexity version and a high complexity version of the task. And what you see is this is the performance relative to benchmark. You can see a very strong main effect in terms of complexity, which won't surprise anyone, right? So you increase the dynamic complexity, the number of interdependent relationships operating in the model, the number of feedback loops, the time delays, and so forth, and you get lower performance in the high complexity task. What you also see here is that the performance plateaus very quickly. The high performance task, you start out with negative performance early on in the first round, but then you improve to positive performance. But by really 4 or 5, your performance is quite stable. The difference between 6 and 7 here, 6 is the last round of the immediate testing phase, and then 15 to 18 weeks later, this was the delayed testing phase. So there was a little bit of a drop-off, but that recovered quite quickly. So what did we find in terms of the relationship between mental models and performance? Well, we found that more accurate mental models do in fact improve performance. So if participants and decision makers understand the causal relationships operating, if they are able to mentally simulate those relationships, then it does improve performance. And I've written here, increasing mental model accuracy by 1 standard deviation improves performance by 22 to 40%, depending on which model we run and depending on which time horizon we look at, which is a lot, right? That is not trivial. Increasing mental model accuracy 1 standard deviation can have a big impact on improving performance. So that gives us a lot of hope, I think, for trying to enhance and enrich mental models. The second finding was that more accurate mental models of the core feedback structure improve performance almost as much as accurate mental models of the entire feedback structure. Now that's even more encouraging. So that says, look, all we have to do, of course, is figure out what are the core feedback structures in the domains in which we want people to really learn more about that underlying feedback structure, and just focus our learning interventions there. 1 standard deviation improvement in mental model accuracy of the core feedback structure improved performance 17 to 38%, depending on the model that we ran. And then we also found 2 types of errors that were very prominent. One type of error was what we called causal blind spots. So this is where there really was a causal relationship operating in the simulation, but participants didn't recognize that. It was a blind spot to them. And some of those were more important than others. If it was part of the core feedback structure, that meant a lot more in terms of undermining performance. And the other type was superstitious causal belief. So this is just the exact opposite. There wasn't an underlying true causal relationship operating, but in fact, the decision makers thought there was a relationship there. And those sorts of superstitious beliefs can lead to all sorts of very unique, idiosyncratic decision rules and strategies, because they believe that they're operating on causal beliefs that are true and real and objective, and in fact, they don't exist in the environment in which they're operating. What did we find between mental models and decision rules? Well, we found that more accurate mental models lead to better decision rules. More accurate mental models of the core feedback structure or the key principles also improved the decision rules by almost the same amount. and participants' decision rules stabilized very rapidly. So we actually estimated the decision rules that they were using in this simulation. So for each of the decisions, what we did is we identified what are the information cues that they're using and estimated the information weights on each of those cues. And what we found is that by the fourth trial block, the decision rules were absolutely stable. By the fourth simulation run, they were absolutely stable. They didn't update those decision rules anymore after that, even if they were performing very, very poorly in the simulation. We also identified 4 distinct strategies, and this is where we took the different decision rules and we combined them into clusters, and we identified these 4 different strategies on the high complexity task, a rapid response strategy that you see here, which had pricing and capacity adjustment decision rules that did exactly that. It helped you adjust capacity and price very quickly. I'm just showing you the graph for target capacity here. These are the decision rules that we estimated for these strategies, put back into the simulation, and then the results of those simulations. And then there were several other. A cautious niche strategy, where you never invest aggressively enough in capacity to grow the business, and so it remains very small, build to initial forecast, and so on. So what we found is that there were significant differences in mental model accuracy between these different strategies, and that adopting a different strategy did result in significant performance differences. So that was what we found in the first study. I'll just cover what we found in the second study quite quickly. In this study, we did a similar design where we had 4 rounds or phases instead of 3 in this case. We measured mental model accuracy after the first 2 simulation rounds, and then we also did a post-tenure questionnaire. The task in this case, the simulation in this case, was a balanced scorecard sim. It's a modified version of the Centrix software balanced scorecard simulation that some of you may have seen in the past. High Performance Systems and Barry Richmond many moons ago developed this simulation with Harvard professors who originated the balanced scorecard, Kaplan and Norton, and this is a modified version of that simulation. And the treatments that we gave to participants were just providing them a simple strategy map. So in the balanced scorecard literature, they talk about the power of having strategy maps. And those strategy maps are very different from the causal loop diagrams that we talk about because they're much simpler. And they also follow these 4 very rigid categories. But I was collaborating with some of my colleagues in accounting. They were really keen on testing whether or not these strategy maps that showed some very simple causal relationships had any impact on the mental models and on the performance of folks operating in this simulation. So again, our performance measure was cumulative profit. Our mental model accuracy measures were exactly the same. The only thing we did differently is we also asked them questions about time delays. We wanted to get some understanding of how accurate their knowledge of time delays were in the system. The performance outcomes were here. The important thing is these 2 conditions are 2 strategy map conditions, and then this line represents a control condition or a control group. So in these 2 conditions, one of them we gave them the strategy map with delay information, with time delay information, and the other one we gave them a strategy map without the time delay information. So those, you can see the performance of both of those are higher, and I can assure you they're statistically higher than the control group. So what did we find? So both strategy map treatments do increase mental model accuracy of causal relationships compared to the control group. The strategy map with treatment, with the delays treatment, also improve mental model accuracy of delays compared to the strategy map without delays and the control group. And both strategy map treatments improve performance compared with the control group, which you could see there. So that provided us with some encouragement that even a very, very simple intervention with causal relationships on it, like these strategy maps from the balanced scorecard, could be effective in improving mental models and therefore improving performance. More accurate mental models of causal relationships and delays also improve performance. So if you understand the delays, you also improve performance a bit more. So what are some takeaways from these studies and from some of the other research that I've done over the last little while and my colleagues? Well, first of all, we need these mental models. Despite their deficiencies, they're really important to us. They help us make sense of this world around us, enable us to consider, decide, and take action quickly. Without mental models, we would have to think through all of these experiences that we encounter every moment of the day anew as a novel problem, and that would be an excruciating process, right? So we need them. They enable us to consider, decide, and act quickly, and more accurate mental models in terms of perceived causal relationships, decision rules, and strategies do in fact increase performance. So that's the really good news. But at the same time, they can make us passive thinkers. They can lead us to reject information that does not fit our current beliefs. You saw the plateaus in performance on study 1. Basically, those decision makers were no longer updating their mental models. They were no longer revising their decision rules and their strategies. They'd reached a level of performance which was a functional level of performance, and they were happy with that. Our mental models automatically fill in missing information for sense making. So some people think about mental models simply as having gaps in the mental models. So not understanding a particular causal relationship. But this research and much of the other research over the last 2 decades shows us that equally mental models can fill in information for us. And like the superstitious beliefs that we found in study 1, they can have really detrimental consequences by filling in that information. Another important factor here is that we're usually unaware of the power of our mental models, right? The mental models are really driving our actions and decisions, and yet most of the time we are unaware of that power. The last point here is that in the studies that I have shown here and many others that I've done, along with numerous other folks, is that mental model accuracy is often very low, quite low. For the studies I showed today, it was the average or the mean mental model accuracy was below 50%, or right around 50%. And these simulation tasks that I've studied in the lab are very, very simple compared to the corporate strategy of Disney, or compared to trying to get stability in Afghanistan, right? So our mental model accuracy genuinely is quite low. The silver lining of that is we can take remedial action and try and enrich our mental models. So we do need to constantly enrich and update them. So how can we do that? I've got some evidence, and there are other folks around the world who also have evidence that using systems thinking and modeling tools to understand the big picture, it's not just the big picture, it's sort of seeing the forest and the trees, right, as Barry Richmond like to say, can enrich our mental models. Causal diagrams, including simple strategy maps, but I've also done some work with causal loop diagrams that are much more complex, can improve our mental models. Building simulation models and doing policy analysis and sensitivity analysis on those simulation models to understand puzzling dynamics can absolutely improve our mental models. And also management flight simulators, trying to help accelerate folks up the learning curve in their respective domain, I think has a lot of promise. It's already shown a lot of promise, and and has shown great results, but there's a lot more to do with it. So a lot more research is needed, and thank you very much. Yeah, great question. So this is exactly why I used a lab experiment. So the simulation tasks that I used, the microworlds that I used, the B&B enterprises, and then the modified version of the balanced scorecard centric task. I knew, because I built those models, what the objective real causal relationships were that were captured in the model. So I used that as a benchmark to measure the accuracy of participants' mental models relative to that. In the wild, in the field, this is harder. This is much harder, and trying to decide what is the most accurate mental model is a tough problem. So it's a great question. My approach in organizations where I've seen this almost every single case, where you've got multiple members of the management team, and they have sometimes slightly different views of the world and sometimes very different views of the world, but there's always some differences, right? And how do you bring those together? And I think the group model building processes that we've got are pretty good at that. Getting people in the same room, talking about the causal relationships that they believe are operating, making those assumptions explicit, at least provides a forum for debate and discussion. And very often what I found is that it's not, when you dig deeper into what people believe are important differences in their mental models, that they're not actually different. They're just less precise, or they're aggregated. Their level of aggregation is different. So it might be that I see one causal relationship and you see the exact opposite. But in fact, what's happening is both of them are operating at different points in time, and as long as you unpack that and disaggregate it in the group model building process, you accommodate both of those. There have been cases where you just got complete stark disagreement, and in those cases, the best thing to do is to build both options into the model and then do sensitivity analysis and see whether it matters, because oftentimes it doesn't matter. If it does matter, then you know at least where to go collect data.
Those measures for performance, obviously part of how you're judging your results. What's your advice for how obvious do they need to be, how much time do you spend breaking them down?
In terms of the performance measures? No, I would say they're not always obvious. Even running a simulated company, cumulative profits is I guess, the closest thing to an easy one that you can get. But survival is important. Market share might be important. Retaining employees might be important. So I would say it's never easy to decide what the objectives are, but you have to do that at the very beginning. Otherwise, you're not sure what you're trying to maximize, right? So for my studies in this case, it was an easy decision because I was just trying to simplify the objective function and make it really easy. In the field, when you're working with organizations, you just have to take time up front to figure out what are the important objectives.
Thanks for the presentation. You mentioned the importance of capturing complexity in our mental models, but how can we make sure that we capture complexity without making the model over-parameterized? Because sometimes complexity leads to over-parameterization of our model, and I think such model can imitate the behavior of the system accurately, but an initial slight change in the the value of the parameter can make the model ineffective. So I would like to know more about that.
So what you're saying is there a danger of going too far? Yeah. So, well, I think some of the studies that I talked about here shed some light on that. I think there's more work to be done. But the encouraging thing for me is that you actually don't need an accurate mental model of the full competitive landscape in the experiments that I showed. You actually just need accuracy on the core feedback structures. And I think that's a much more achievable task. If we can identify what the core feedback structures are that are driving the dynamic behavior in the context in which we care about, it's much easier to design learning interventions to help people develop accurate mental models on those small pieces of structure rather than on the full complex landscape. But there's more work needed there.
Yeah, for you, are you aware or is there any work being done with mental modeling in the development of advanced or cognitive capabilities and artificial intelligence? Is there any work being done on that sort of side?
So I'm only aware of a tiny little bit of it. I am sure that there is work going on there because I've seen some of the grants from US DARPA that some of my colleagues around the world have contributed to, and I myself have had a grant here in Australia collaborating with the Defense Forces on mental models in that space. So artificial intelligence is a new element to that, probably over the last 5 years. So I'm less familiar with that, but certainly in trying to understand mental models, understand decision rules, and understand the consequences of those, there's been a lot of work. Sorry, I didn't quite understand it. You said a biased mental model. Yep.
You think of something for some particular reason and you just go to that way, even when that is not the real case, would that not cause more harm than good?
Well, sure. I think deficient mental models are always a problem. And depending on the nature of the deficiencies and how important those relationships are in the context in which they're operating, they can be really important. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that comment. I'm not sure whether you're asking something different, whether what you're asking is if we intervene and enrich the mental models in a particular way, do we have a chance of doing more harm than good? I hope not. I'll have to revise my ethics applications. Look, I think we should take that offline because it's a deeper conversation. I'd like to say no off the cuff, but but I'm not sure that that would do justice to the question.
Have you looked at the way in which the model is represented? They mostly represent these images. Have you looked at whether more text enhancement could help? And I think in the extreme case of someone who is blind, who will not be able to see the image.
So it's a good question. Isn't working, I guess. It's a good question. I myself haven't done work in that area, so I couldn't speak to that. What I do know is that the format in which information is presented in the decision environment has a big impact. So there's been lots of work done on different information presentation formats. So, you know, the strategy map is one way, one information format. Tables tables with numbers, like Excel charts, is another way. Graphics, bar charts or line charts over time, or other graphical formats. There's a lot of evidence that makes a difference in terms of what's perceived and what's paid attention to in the information environment. So I'm absolutely sure that the format has a role to play, but I haven't done much of that work myself.
If I can squeeze one question. So go back to the blockchain, unfortunately we don't appreciate the power of the individual display in the way we make decisions. If you put this on one hand and on the other hand, many of the methods that we use to understand and capture performance, many of them are time and resource intensive. So if you put these two things together, from your experience, how do you the business case to organizations to fund this type of work?
So it's a great question because it is labor intensive, but that's an easy one because what I tell folks is there's no sense in starting a project on a topic or a problem which isn't important to the organization. So let's work on something that's important. Work on something that's important to you and important to the stakeholders that are going to be involved, and then the investment is warranted. As long as you work on something that really can move the needle for the organization, then they don't mind putting in the investment.